was never going to be easy. An isolationist, America First president, and an outspoken veteran, hawkish former U.S. ambassador to the UN. The final straw between Donald Trump and John Bolton may have been that aborted summit with the Taliban at Camp David, but Bolton's days as national security advisor were long numbered. The pair had differed on Venezuela, Russia, North Korea. It's Trump's decision to call off airstrikes against Iran after the shooting down of a U.S. drone off its coast back in July that signaled perhaps a turning point in Washington's maximum pressure policy against the Islamic Republic. Does Bolton's departure raise the prospect of a first handshake between U.S. and Iranian leaders since before the 1979 revolution? 10 days ahead of UN Week in New York, we'll ask our panel and see if French efforts to keep the 2015 nuclear deal alive could yet bear fruits. More broadly, what foreign policy surprises can we expect next out of Washington as we head into, yes, a presidential election campaign year? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Washington after Bolton, and joining us from the U.S. Capitol, former military and intelligence advisor Michael Pregent, senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. Thank you for being with us. Here in the studio, we welcome back former French ambassador to Iran, François Nicoulot.
Hello.
Good to see you. Welcome back as well to Julien Théron, lecturer at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po.
Hi.
How are you?
Fine, and you?
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag F24debate. You're fired. I quit. Personnel movements at the White House once again playing out over Twitter. First, Donald Trump announcing, I disagreed strongly with many of his suggestions, as did others in the administration, adding that he'd asked for his national security advisor's resignation. Bolton shooting back, I offered to resign last night, and President Trump said, let's talk about it tomorrow. When you look at those exchanges, Ambassador Nicoulot, do you wish you'd had Twitter when you were stationed in Tehran?
That's a good question. Well, no, it's another world, really. It's really another world when I compare it to classic diplomacy. And this kind of behavior, it's something totally new. And I'm happy that I left active service before this kind of things could happen. It happened in the United States. Up to now, it apparently does not happen in France yet.
Not yet.
Not yet.
At this point in time, because we're 3 years into Trump's administration, are you surprised by this kind of tumult inside of the White House? Are you surprised when you see this kind of?
It's this is the Trump style, and we have to accept it. And in fact, Bolton was the national security advisor who remained the longest time, really, in this position. And but obviously things could not go well, and we've seen what happened. Of course, it's a big obstacle, a big roadblock which has been lifted, but there are still remaining many other roadblocks on the solution to the current crisis between Iran, in particular, and the United States.
Which we'll get back to. Julien Théron, Ambassador Nicoulot pointing it out correctly. This is Donald Trump's third national security advisor. Bolton lasted 16 months. Did you think it would be that long when he was appointed?
Why not? Why not? I know it's a bit surprising to see so many, very different characters working together. Like you said in the introduction, one is very hawkish, neoconservative person, and the other one is, let's say, the master of the deal, as he wants to present himself. Although I think that it could have been going along for the two men, and I'm a little bit surprised, and we might see the beginning, the birth of a Trump doctrine tonight, actually, by refusing this hawkish behavior that was proposing Bolton on Iran, on North Korea, and so on. So yes, it might be a little bit surprising for me.
All right, before I turn to Michael Pregent, let's listen to the big winner, perhaps, in all of this, the U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who's proved adept at navigating the treacherous waters of White House politics?
I don't talk about the inner workings of how this all goes. We all give our candid opinions. There were many times Ambassador Bolton and I disagree. That's to be sure, but that's true for lots of people with whom I interact. My mission set is always to make sure, as I run the Department of State, is to deliver America's diplomacy, and to work with the team, whether it's the Treasury or the President's staff, to make sure we get good outcomes. I know everyone's talked about this for an awfully long time. There were definitely places that Ambassador Bolton and I had different views about how we should proceed.
All right, so gently throwing him under the bus. Michael, your thoughts on Mike Pompeo now, because, well, on paper, they're both hawks, right?
Right. I think Pompeo's right where the president wants someone to be. Mattis didn't want to do a lot against Iran, which was surprising to us, those of us that worked for General Mattis when he was in uniform. And Bolton wanted to do too much. I think the president's comfortable with Pompeo's position of being right in the middle of this. What I'm concerned about, with the departure of Mattis at DOD, we may have more of a technocrat yes man at the Pentagon. And I don't want to see that in the NSC. I want a team of rivals in our national security arena. I want the president to disagree with his national security advisor and his Secretary of Defense.
I'm going to Michael, I'm going to interrupt you because we're having a bit of sound problems. Sounds like there's a little bit of feedback. So if there's a way, perhaps we can clear that up and get right back to you. That would be great. Apologies for that. And at this point in time, I want to introduce from Washington someone who I certainly don't want to cross because, Kurt Mills, on September 9th, you write a piece for the American Conservative where you say, is John Bolton's time up? And 24 hours later, he's out of a job. A premonition?
No, just straight reporting. I think this was a long time coming. I can't claim to know the exact minute and hour and morning that it would happen, but I thought the meeting over the weekend was extraordinary with Afghanistan, the scuttled Taliban talks of Camp David, and it was the coup de grace, the poison chalice, if you will, for National Security Advisor Bolton. And as we can see, the president is making a change. Unclear what that change is going to be, whether or not he replaces him with somebody in Bolton's mold or makes a radical departure from Boltonism.
You just heard Michael Pregin say that he's worried that without Bolton in there, you might be with Donald Trump may be surrounded by a team of yes men, and you need differing point of views. Your thoughts?
I think that's a farcical view. I think the story of the Trump administration has been personnel and the president's inability to execute his favorite policies because of the intransigence of his own personnel. Whether or not you agree with Donald Trump's policies is immaterial. The president won and ran on an election platform of extricating America from a number of theaters abroad. And although he hasn't entered any new theaters, although he's been saber-rattling on Iran and China, generally speaking, he has been unable in the first term to execute a lot of his promises. Heading into re-election, he needs a national security staff that's going to be able to do that if he hopes to win again and to look like he's done at least part of the work that the voters sent him to do.
Julien Théron, when you said there could be the beginning of a Trump doctrine, what did you mean?
I think that he hesitated himself about what he wants to do with the world. For instance, remember the Iran affair when he said that he was launching a missile and actually he said for whatever reason that he wanted it to abort the mission or something like that 10 minutes after. Remember also on Syria, he was the one who actually struck Syria. So yes, after a few days of thinking and there was no casualties on the Syrian side and so on, but he was the one who struck Syria when President Obama did not. So you see that there were some elements saying that Donald Trump could actually engage in enemies. He retracted from the Iranian deal as well. And listened, I mean, he hired John Bolton at this time and so on. So you see there were contradictions between engagement.
So what's that doctrine? What's that doctrine?
Well, for the moment, there is still not, according to me, a Trump doctrine. He hesitated, but clearly today is taking the side of dealing well, perhaps he wants to appear as a deal maker and a peacemaker in the world, but it's tough and it's not easy. See how he actually retracted not only from the Iran deal, but also from Afghanistan, from a possible deal with the Taliban. So I think he's hesitating, but that tonight is taking a little bit more the sign of possible deals. Whether it's a good thing or not, it's different question.
Let's talk about John Bolton. You knew the writing was on the wall with his vocal objection to Donald Trump visiting the border with North Korea at the end of June. Instead, he found himself on a previously scheduled trip to Mongolia, front and center. Instead, on that trip was Trump's North Korea negotiator, Stephen Biegun, the same John Bolton, by the way, who was forced to resign as George W. Bush's ambassador to the UN because Democrats refused to confirm his nomination, who finds himself at that point already out in the cold. And there is the sense, Michael Pregent, that Donald Trump hired him because he saw him on, was impressed with his performance on talk shows on Fox News. And he appears to have gone against Bolton after reportedly hearing advice against that strike against Iran, also on Fox News. How much credence do we give to that?
Well, there's a talk here in D.C. If you want to motivate the president and get him to do something, you do it on Fox News. So you bypass traditional means of getting the attention of a president. I hope you guys can hear me better now.
Slightly better.
Yeah, sorry about that. I think my biggest concern, like I said before, is that the president just puts a yes man in there or a yes woman. And I think we need a little bit more pushback. I do favor a team of rivals. I agree that may not be what President Trump is doing, but there are some serious issues coming up. And we need a national security advisor with foreign policy experience and national security experience to be able to deal with things like the Iran deal, to deal with things like China and with Russia. And while Bolton may have fallen in disfavor with the president, he was right about the Taliban. He was right that the president shouldn't have gone into North Korea. And I believe, as you know, he was right about exiting the Iran deal. But Pompeo also wanted to exit the Iran deal. Those things were already in motion before Bolton even became the national security advisor.
So what happens at the UN in New York? It would have been hard to imagine a handshake, as Emmanuel Macron would like to see it, between the Iranian and US presidents on the watch of a John Bolton. Let's take a listen to the now former national security advisor.
We will continue to increase the pressure on the Iranian regime until it abandons its nuclear weapons program and ends its violent activities across the Middle East, including conducting and supporting terrorism around the world.
Ambassador Nicolò, with Bolton out, does that increase the chance of that handshake in New York at UN week later this month?
A little bit. Still many obstacles, and for such a meeting in New York in a few weeks, the U.S. administration has to make a gesture, has to give something. It would be totally impossible to imagine that the Iranian would accept a meeting if there is not a positive sign coming from Washington. But of course, the Iranian also should have to make something, to offer something. And this is what the French president is working on at the present moment.
Kurt Mills, would you like to see that handshake?
I would. I think it's the right thing to do. I think that the Emmanuel Macron's decision to try to sort of Shanghai Foreign Minister Zarif into the G7 did not occur in the vacuum. I think clearly he sensed an opening. I think the firing of Bolton is evidence of the presidential desire to see a deal. I think senior sources are already telling me that the Israelis have partially resigned themselves to a Rouhani Trump meeting. And I think that's for the best, because whether or not you think Trump should have nullified the JCPOA or not, it's where we are. And I think war and continued confrontation that's unnecessary, if a deal can be struck, is the right course. And I think, at least from my own perspective, a national security advisor that will grease the wheels on that approach is the superior course.
Michael Pregent?
Okay, I'd like to. Well, Rouhani is not a decision maker. The supreme leader decides everything. We talked about this about a month ago when we had that July 15th date and everybody was looking. Zarif's not a decision maker. Rouhani's not a decision maker. It's just window dressing. If the president meets Rouhani, Rouhani can't do anything anyway. And some are even saying that Bolton being dismissed is the gesture the Iranians were looking for. We'll dismiss Bolton and then we can talk. But as far as those 12 points, those were Pompeo's points, the 12 points that Iran has to come to before we re-enter negotiations, before we lift sanctions. So I don't buy into this. It's either a handshake or war. It's a handshake or more security degradation. This is what war with Iran looks like. It's these attempts to seize oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz. It's getting their Arab militias to launch rockets and missiles at U.S. allies. This is what war with Iran looks like. There is no invasion of Iran. There's no invasion like Afghanistan or Iraq. This is what it looks like. And I think if the world just simply waited Iran out and let them continue with this tantrum and just continue to impose sanctions, we'd get a better outcome. Russia and China are not interested in the Islamic Republic having a nuclear weapon, and they hold the NPT, the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, higher than they do the JCPOA. I would almost argue there's no need for a JCPOA as long as the NPT is in place. And I would also remind everyone that Iran continues to cheat on the NPT as well.
All right, so Kurt Mills, because I know you have to leave us just very briefly before we go to the break. You still want that handshake?
Absolutely. I think it's clear. I think there's a lot of fiat in what your previous guest just said, that a war with Iran wouldn't involve an invasion, wouldn't involve people getting killed, wouldn't involve unconscionable blowback, wouldn't be highly unpredictable. You're talking about 70 million Iranians versus 30 million Iraqis. You're talking about a highly urban, highly dangerous, highly armed country. For what? What's the goal? What's the purpose? I understand that this is an Islamic autocracy, and that Islamic autocracy should not be viewed as a peer of a democratic power. However, they're staying, and we got to be adults in the room and deal with a country in a dangerous part of the world like adults.
All right, we're going to pick up on these points when we come back. Kurt Mills, thanks for joining us. The rest of our panel will be with us. You're watching the France 24
Thank you.
debate. Welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're taking in news that the America First President Donald Trump has got more of an isolationist stance on foreign policy, has just parted ways with his very hawkish veteran national security advisor, John Bolton. We're talking about it with Michael Pregent, who is senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, joins us from Washington. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to former French ambassador to Iran, François Nicoulot, and Julien Théron, lecturer at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. We were talking about whether that standoff between the U.S. and Iran could move now. The reaction from Tehran to Bolton's ouster, Washington should distance itself from warmongers, the statement. Delana de Souza has more.
He was viewed as the most hawkish member of the Trump administration on Iran, and now John Bolton has been shown the door. While his departure may signal a shift in stance from Washington, Tehran is keeping the door to diplomacy shut for now.
Americans have to realize that warmongering and warmongers are not to their benefit. They should not only abandon warmongering, but also abandon their maximum pressure policy.
The response from Iran's president comes following Tuesday's statement from the U.S. Treasury Secretary. Standing alongside the Secretary of State, Steven Mnuchin insisted that sanctions on Iran would remain in place.
We've done more sanctions on Iran than anybody, and it's absolutely working. Now, the president has made clear he's happy to take a meeting with no preconditions, but we are maintaining the maximum pressure campaign.
Last year, the United States pulled out of the nuclear deal with Iran and reimposed crippling sanctions. The US also took aim at Iran's oil exports in the hope that bringing the Iranian economy to its knees would force its leaders to talk. And while the campaign of maximum pressure is set to remain in place, Donald Trump isn't ruling out a face-to-face.
It could happen, yeah. No problem with meeting. Iran should straighten out because, frankly, they're in very bad position right now. And they should straighten it out because they could straighten it out very easy.
Donald Trump and Hassan Rouhani will both be in New York for the UN General Assembly at the end of the month. It remains to be seen if back-channel efforts to get the two leaders to talk bear fruit.
You were saying before the break, Ambassador Nicolo, that there's a slight chance that the lines may move a little and that we could have that surprise handshake. What would that handshake achieve?
This is the whole question, because it's true that Trump needs this diplomatic success for his electoral campaign. And it's a bit pathetic the way he repeats, I'm ready to meet the Iranians, I'm ready to meet the Iranians, there is no preconditions and so on. But at the same time, of course, sanctions are there. And without alleviating these sanctions, very little can happen. On the other side, in Iran, such decisions are collective decisions. We should not say that it's the supreme leader who decides about everything. There is a kind of national security council also in Iran, and this kind of important decisions are taken collectively. And so,
but he has the final say, Ayatollah Khamenei.
Yes, theoretically, but in fact, when there is a majority within the National Security Council, it happens quite often that the supreme leaders let things go. I remember in one case saying, I don't agree with what I see, you're all in favor of negotiations at the time with Europeans. I don't agree, but I won't stop you. You want to negotiate, you go and negotiate. I just want on the record that you put that the supreme leader was against it. You see, it's interesting. It's not the Saddam Hussein type autocracy where there is one man with a pistol on the table and who imposes his vision of things. It's really a collective decision. I just say that, and I finish on this. That means that Rouhani has some power. He has a parcel of power. He can exert an influence on the final decision.
So, end of August, there's a G7 summit in Biarritz, France. Emmanuel Macron invites in the foreign minister as the surprise guest. We saw the one-on-one with Donald Trump before that, the one-on-one afterwards, the joint press conference. What happened in Biarritz?
What happened? It depends. One can say very little happened in the substance. But what was important, of course, was the meeting, the very fact that Zarif came especially for this occasion. It did not participate to the Biarritz, to the G7, of course. It was on the side that he met the French, but he met Macron and so on. And this was a signal. It was of course, it was a very visible and very strong signal from the French side that the French side was taking the things in hand. But
we shall see. So that was then. Now we're 10 days out from UN Week in New York. Julien Théron, you were saying in part one of our discussion how you've watched Donald Trump recently. One step forward, then he pulls back when it comes to the Iran strike. Almost that summit on the Taliban, and then he pulls back. What's going on?
It's also the case with John Bolton, actually. It's seen as a major step toward Iran or something, but Iran doesn't think so. I mean, if you hear what President Rouhani is saying, is that, yeah, all right, they have to push forward and abandon the maximum pressure. And Secretary of the Treasury, Mnuchin, said the inverse. He said that we will go forward, we impose very powerful sanctions, and it's working very well, which is not the case. Technically, Iran just increased the amount of uranium it can get and the level of enrichment it can get. So it's not working at all. And now the Iranians, like the ambassadors used to say, it's actually from the US, from Iran, it is seen as the US have to do something more, like release the sanctions or something like that. But in this case, I don't see happening, if it stays like that, I don't see happening a handshake at the UN General Assembly at the end of the month. So I don't see that happening in this regard.
Would it be a good idea, a handshake?
Well, it depends what it is for. But I think that, well, Donald Trump retracted from a deal. It was a feeble deal, but it was a deal preventing Iran to get the nuclear weapon. He got out of it because he wanted a better deal. If they can manage to do so, why not? But it has to be proven. And for now, their strategy is actually not working.
Do you agree with that, Michael Pregent?
Well, I'd like to just remind the ambassador that before Zarif arrived at the G7 summit, he said before he arrived, he undermined Macron. He said, we will not renegotiate ballistic missiles. We will not renegotiate anything in the Iran deal. The U.S. has to lift sanctions before we talk. So before Zarif even lands, he already derailed Macron. So we have to remember those things. And to the comment from your last guest that left, no military analyst ever says there are 350 million Americans that are going to take on 70 million Iranians. Those are just silly arguments, this war talk. But the handshake will be meaningless, and we have to also remember that Rouhani will give a very negative speech in New York. He will talk about economic terrorism. He will talk about all the things the U.S. is doing. And I see it very hard to have a handshake if Rouhani has a very negative speech against the U.S. and also Israel and Saudi Arabia, U.S. allies in the region.
That's very
We can count on negative speeches from President Trump and from Mr. Netanyahu also. I think that it will be even at this level of reciprocal attacks, one against the other.
If I may,
That's true. But what do you think about Zarif undermining Macron before he even showed up to the G7?
No, I mean, well, this is the constant. Sorry, this is the constant Iranian position. I mean, we won't negotiate on missiles because this is part of our. It's a sovereign matter, and it's true. I mean, defense. Nobody can negotiate on defense matter except if it has been vanquished in a war. You know. But the only possibility to find a solution on this very serious problem, I agree, the missile problem, is to find a collective agreement, a collective arrangement in the region, the way it was done in Europe. In fact, this is the OSCE, if you remember, and but on a bilateral basis. The Iranian won't give up anything on the ballistic missile. That's for sure. It has to be within the region, between the people of the region.
It's really interesting at this point because in the region, indeed, there's nothing doing much by the US nowadays. They retracted even from Israel a bit. I mean, President Netanyahu is not happy at all with all what is happening with Iran. And if there will be a lot of things depending on the Israeli elections, because if
I was going to say the firing of John Bolton 1 week before a snap general election in Israel, what message did that send?
It's very important because if Prime Minister Netanyahu stays in power, actually he will probably do a lot of different steps that will exacerbate the tensions. When I say that, I speak about the Israeli Defense Forces striking Iranian proxies in Iraq or in Syria, including at the border with Israel. And everything was supposed to be struck by a deal with the Russians, but it's not working. There's tensions with Hezbollah, contained tensions, but still. And what I mean is that there's a bilateral, even if Trump actually retracted a bit from his friendship with Prime Minister Netanyahu, well, there's engagement from the US with Israel. And if tensions rises up, US might be obliged to step in a way.
Before next Tuesday's poll in Israel, Michael Pregent, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, due to travel to Moscow on Thursday. Now, of course, there's a sizable Russian community in Israel, so part of that is campaigning. But what do you read into it otherwise?
Well, I think it's to get assurances that Russia will continue to sit on its hands as the Israeli Air Force strikes Qasem Soleimani targets in Syria and Iraq. Again, this is something that is not being protested by Iraqis or Syrians, for that matter, that Israel is actually striking Iranian targets in Iraq and Syria. I think the Putin relationship with Israel, I would argue that Putin values the relationship with Israel ahead of Iran. Iran is a resource-heavy country, but the actual relationship that I think Putin values more is the relationship with Israel, and he's seeking to take advantage of the relationship with Iran.
The moving parts in the region, by the way, include, and you've been mentioning it, Iraq, where the U.S. and Iran are rivals for influence, also at times de facto partners in the fight against ISIS. It's quite a surprise to see Iraqi cleric Muqtada al-Sadr in Tehran on the Shiite holy day of Ashura, sitting alongside Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and the commander of the elite Quds force of the Revolutionary Guards, Major General Qasem Soleimani. Is this Michael Pregin, because of late Muqtada al-Sadr had been distancing himself from Tehran? What do you read into this?
It's just words. This is not a surprise to anybody who's followed Muqtada al-Sadr. In 2007, we had to hide the fact that Muqtada al-Sadr was in Iran from his followers, because his followers were so against the Iranian influence. We had to hide the fact that he was in Iran so that we could somehow curry some courtship with him so we could actually work on reconciliation issues. There's no surprise. Muqtada al-Sadr idolizes Nasrallah of Lebanese Hezbollah, and he fears Qasem Soleimani. Qasem Soleimani stood next to Sadr to show Iraqis that Sadr is in his pocket, and Iraqis understand that, and they're offended by those photos. Muqtada al-Sadr did not want those photos to get out. That's something Qasem Soleimani wanted to get out, so his Iraqi followers could see that Muqtada al-Sadr is in his pocket.
And on the U.S. side, what's the view looking ahead now when they see those pictures?
We're actually ignoring what's going on in Iraq. If you listen to some analysts, you'd be surprised that Israel is conducting airstrikes in Iraq against IRGC proxies that are moving into Syria and launching rockets on our allies. Iraq is lost. When I say Iraq is lost, Baghdad is lost to Tehran. But the rest of the country is crying out for a guarantor, for an advocate, to help them break away from malign Iranian influence, not from regular trade with the country, not from religious relationships with the country, but the fact that Iran decides Iraq's prime minister, Iran has primacy over Iraq's security forces, and no one is rallying to the flag in Iraq. There are no Iraqi protests against Israeli airstrikes in Iraq, and that is a big story.
This is really interesting what you say, Michael, because actually since 2003, you can see that the three last presidents from the US were actually lacking consistency in the Middle East. I'm not talking especially about Iraq in 2003, but we all know the disaster it went in. Barack Obama's Syria policy was a complete disaster. We had terrorism and Iran and the refugees, and Bashar al-Assad. So really, it was a complete collapse. And Trump is hesitating, but there are some US assets. There are some US allies. But today, the US allies, Saudi Arabia and Israel, are not that actually fond of what is doing Donald Trump. The fleet is not keeping the Strait of Hormuz safe. The US influence in Iraq is feeble, like we just said. In Syria, there's a military presence, but we don't have a card to play with our US allies. There are some really good assets over there, but they lack consistency and influence in the US. That's why Putin is trying to step in. But actually, the US have a lot of assets, but don't have a proper strategy there.
All right. And in the US, in both parties, there is division, campaign fever rising ahead of an election in 2020 where Donald Trump will be seeking re-election. The resignation of Bolton, well, it's proving another one of those focal points inside of the Republican Party. On the one hand, you have the likes of Utah Senator Mitt Romney, who's praised Bolton to the skies, and Romney's fellow Republican Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky.
Bolton's view that regime change is the answer, that we should go around the world, topple regimes, and replace them with American-style democracy is naive. It's a dangerous worldview that leads us to endless war. I think specifically on the Afghan war, I think the president really does want to end the war in Afghanistan. I think he could, but he needs people around him who support the vision he's putting forward of declaring victory.
Michael Pregent, Donald Trump campaigned in 2016 on the promise of bringing the GIs home. Is within the Republican Party, did we just hear the majority view right now?
We don't seem to get Iraq or Afghanistan right. And the negotiations with the Taliban were only strengthening their position. They were killing Americans on the way out. And we already see a rise in ISIS activity in Afghanistan, in Al-Qaeda activity, in the Haqqani network. And if you look at Taliban videos, they look like ISIS. They're fit. They're wearing black shirts. They're doing exercises. They're not the Pashtun militia of old. They've actually become more modern and more dangerous.
But my question,
so I just think
my question is, is that the opinion of the majority of voters inside of the Republican Party? What we just heard from Rand Paul, which is that we need to get out.
Yeah, that's exactly what the voters think. The voters are tired of these wars. We don't have a strategy to win them. So if I was sending a soldier now, I used to be in the military, to Afghanistan, my advice would be keep your head down and come home safe, because there's no winning there. There's no winning in Iraq. We get these things wrong. We basically handed Iraq over to Iran, and now the Taliban are as strong as they've been since 2001 almost, and that's a big deal. So I think if there is election turnover here in the United States in 2020, we're likely to pull out of Iraq, pull out of Syria, pull out of Afghanistan, and Russia and China are already tilting in, and it'll make us have to come back. We'll just come back 6 steps behind and behind the 8 ball.
François Nicolo, you have a Trump administration which has wavered between hawkish positions and more isolationist ones, or America first is how Donald Trump puts it. If you're at the French Foreign Ministry today and you're a member of NATO and the most powerful ally is the United States, how do you calculate your foreign policy, your defense policy at this point?
Not too easy at the present moment, that's for sure. And what could I say? It's true that Trump is unpredictable. Sometimes it is predictable, and some other time it is unpredictable. And as a whole, it makes it very unpredictable indeed. And at the same time, it's true that he's the one who calls the shots at the end. And as the French foreign minister said recently, we have only one interlocutor in Washington, and this is Trump. And we have to speak with Trump. And this is why this is what Macron tried to do. And will it work? This is a big question. And there's no French mediation or intermediation.
So this is the question we're unsure of.
Yeah.
We've had this world order since 1945.
Yes.
The Berlin Wall fell. That world order, to a certain degree, stayed with France being inside of that NATO alliance.
Mm-hmm.
From Donald Trump, is Donald Trump walking away from that or not? We're still asking that question 3 years into his presidency.
It's true, and it's true that there is. Let's say, some anguish really among European circles about the future of European defense. And when President Macron again said that he wants to open up to Russia, for instance, and to build a new European security frame, it's certainly, this new policy is driven by the fact that on the other side, we cannot count on the U.S. as we could, or we felt we could, in ancient times. That's very true. We are basculating in another world, in another time. Really, that's
another world, another time. And on Wednesday, we saw Julien Théron, the president-elect of the European Commission, unveil her team of commissioners for the next 5 years, and it doesn't have the name defense portfolio, because that would be off limits to most countries to have a. But nonetheless, we're starting to see the embryo of what Emmanuel Macron has been espousing, this European defense force. It's something that's been talked about for decades. Is it closer to reality today or not?
Well, I think that dealing with the US from a European point of view, there are three problems. I already spoke about the strategic indecision. Then there is this, what we can hear as a demission from NATO or something, which is not the case, actually, because they're still in. They actually moved some troops in Eastern Europe, and they are still working with us. So what it underlines is actually another problem, which is a bit of a gap between the White House and the administration. We see that in a lot of different places. We see that, according to NATO, the speeches. It's true. Politically, you want to speak to somebody to the White House, it has to be Trump, because we have seen that the advisors, well, there's a dissension.
So go on Fox News.
Yeah, but you have a bit of a gap between the White House and the administration, the actual administration. Remember, when Trump said, I'm calling the troops off Syria, the troops are still there. We, France, still work with the US inside Syria, and the US actually just did a little with Turkey in Syria. So what I mean that the administration is a kind of guardian of the US interest on the ground, and the president, who is impetuous, is actually doing sometimes some speeches and so on, but there's a bit of a gap. You might think that it's a good thing, but actually when you are an external actor like Europe, you don't know, it's not very easy to deal with.
All right, Michael Pregent, if you had advice to give to France, member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, would you say stick to NATO or find a different plan?
Don't listen to the tweets. Engage with him directly and stay in NATO.
Why? What makes you say that?
Help us get Erdogan to be more of a NATO partner as well. I mean, because I love the language coming from Macron. He's tough in language on ballistic missiles, on doing more in Syria, on not losing gains against ISIS. And I think the president, if you ignore the tweets, the president's there too. We didn't leave Syria. You're right. The president was saying we should get out of Syria, but the last thing the president wanted to do was to suffer an ISIS resurgence ahead of an election. Something he criticized President Obama for leaving Iraq too soon and giving birth to ISIS. Stay in it, guide the president, ignore the tweets, stay tough. It's good to see the French be tough in the Middle East. I love it, for one.
All right, we'll leave it on that note. I want to thank you so much, Michael Pregent, for joining us from Washington. I want to thank Ambassador Nicolo. I want to thank as well Julien Théron. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.